Okay, so we are going to be running a series of 5 talks on the history of medicine. And apart from being interesting in and of itself, it's always nice to get a sense of how your career has been impacted by everything that's come before it. It's easy to think that we have this light switch of ignorance, click to science that occurred in medicine. And that's a gross simplification, and it leaves out a lot of the subtleties as well as a lot of the amazing and frankly horrific stories that resulted from that. So what we're going to start with today is the history of ancient medicine, as far back as any historical records can take us, up to around the Renaissance. And then the subsequent lectures will spend a lot of time running from the Renaissance, roughly the 1500s, up until the current day. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Please raise your hand. Don't feel like you have to keep it quiet. And let's get started. Now, the most ancient bit of medical evidence we have is the practice of trepanation, and you can see it up there. Now, trepanation is drilling a hole or gouging a hole in someone's skull so that they're able to get in there. And if we go back into ancient history, why do you guys think someone might want to dig a hole in someone's skull? Not out of aggression. Headache, sure. What else? What's that? Expel demons. Yeah, so we know the head is roughly where thought and things like that happen. People are doing bad things. Maybe they've got a demonic possession going on, and if we let the demon out, happy day. Now, this seems pretty rough, but if you take a look at the archaeological evidence, trepanation was practiced all over the world, often to a high degree. Early trepanation looked a lot like things on the left. Did that person survive? Probably not. Why? Now, antibiotics, good, but there's actual physical evidence in front of your face that tells you they didn't survive. Sharp cuts into the skull, no evidence of healing. How about on the right? Yeah, they survived 2 trepanations, in fact. So trepanation actually did not have a horrible mortality associated with it as time went by. Now, there were certainly lots of other medical practices involved in ancient and prehistoric cultures. We just don't know what they are because they didn't leave a physical record like trepanation. Now, who had this game when they were kids? Now, I'm pretty sure this next thing is a joke, but if anyone ever finds this, I want it really, really badly. So if you find trepanation, please give me a heads up. I want in on that eBay little experience right there. So in addition to trepanation, the Peruvians are pretty well known as, there's some evidence of their medical practice in the written records as Europeans invaded the Americas. So we have skulls from the Peruvians, and it was known that one of the things that they would do would be to try to link supernatural causes of disease and supernatural treatments. So if someone was ill or injured, they would actually sometimes hold a guinea pig over the affected area and then sacrifice the guinea pig and inspect its organs. This was thought to provide some measure of prognosis in terms of what the disease was and how it could be treated. So that is something we have record of from the Americas. Going back into ancient Assyria and Babylon, a very similar thing would happen. If people were diseased, it was often considered to be due to supernatural influences, demonic possession, something that your parents did is negatively impacting you and you're being judged for that. And diagnosis was often done by sacrificing animals and inspecting their organs. Now, what organ do we have a stone model of in the bottom left corner there? Second year students, I'm looking your direction. That is the liver. You got the gallbladder there as well. That's not actually a human liver. That's a model of a sheep liver, and all the symbols on it were spots to compare to the sacrificed liver and see, okay, there's a tumor in this area. There's a little malformation in this area, and that was supposed to tell you something about the prognosis of your patient. So that was called haruspicy, or investigating the organs of sacrificial animals to tell the future or prognosticate on how your patient was going to pull through. Treatment was done both in a supernatural way with priests as well as a group of secular healers. There were people who would go around and actually give what we'd consider to be fairly standard first aid treatments to help people get better. The first written example of how physicians were treated in society comes from Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi was a king who actually laid down a legal code, and by contemporary standards, it's pretty harsh. but it was a big improvement over the standard at the time, which was the king does what he wants and the hell with you if you don't like it. So laws were actually laid out and prices were set for things. My personal favorite relating to physicians, I'll run through this real quick, there's a lot there. But if a doctor has treated a free man with a metal knife for a severe wound, etc., he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. Not so bad. If a doctor has treated a free man with a metal knife for a severe wound and has caused the man to die or opened his tumor with a metal knife and destroyed the man's eye, his hands shall be cut off. So as you get out and you work through your EHR, you try to get government reimbursement. It could be worse. It could be worse. No one will attempt to cut your hands off as far as I can tell. Now we move into the Egyptian period, and one thing that people associate with Egyptians overwhelmingly is mummification. We have a great deal of evidence about how the Egyptians treated the dead bodies to preserve them. They took out all the internal organs except for the heart. It was left in place. The brain was actually kind of removed with a little hooked instrument. You can see there in the x-ray. The organs were stored in little canopic jars and then put back into the body. The heart was left in place because it was considered to be the seat of the soul, and that was left in the body during mummification. What's strange about mummification is it didn't translate to Egyptian medical practice at all. This was an entirely separate practice done for the purpose of memorializing people after death, and it didn't really have any anatomical expertise translate over to the medical practice. Medicine in ancient Egypt was obsessed mostly with dealing with what was called a flux, F-U-L-X. A flux would be when something bad you ate moved out of your gut into your bloodstream and created a tumor, or kind of a pustule or some other swelling. It was thought to be undigested or poorly digested food that would flux to another part of the body that caused disease and death. And treatment was mostly directed towards trying to get that out of the body. So enemas, bleeding, purgatives, things of that nature were thought to help move that flux out of the body so it could be dealt with and resolved. Other types of treatments happened in temples. Imhotep was an actual person. There is evidence of this person living. He was more than just the bad guy in the Mummy movies. Anybody ever see the Mummy movies? Okay, good. You admit to it. That's nice of you. So Imhotep was an actual person who was considered to be a great intellectual of the very ancient kingdoms, about 2700 BC, and was then, I wouldn't say deified directly, but just got to be considered as a god of medicine and healing. People would be brought to these temples, and they would be healed there after they had what was called a therapeutic dream. The dream would be interpreted by the priests at the temple. They'd tell the person what changes to make in their life to get better. They also had a very extensive pharmacopoeia. They had a great big catalog of drugs, including opium, alcohol, things of that nature, that we have evidence of from papyrus that's still been maintained. Since Egypt was relatively dry and hot, paper actually was still around from those days, and we can read those papyri. So one fun thing I thought is that there's a theory going around that because the Egyptians were very well versed in pharmacy at the time, the Eye of Horus is where we get that unpronounceable pharmacy symbol. Probably wrong, but it's cool, so we'll pretend that it's right. So Greek mercenaries who fought for the Egyptian pharaohs went back home, and amongst the things that they brought back to Greece was this idea of incubation in a temple in order to heal. And instead of Imhotep, Asclepius was the Greek god that people would go to his temples, incubate there, wait for the therapeutic dream, and be treated. Asclepius, like Imhotep, was probably a real person who just kind of moved into the pantheon of Greek gods as the centuries passed. And one thing that we're really well known to associate with Asclepius is the staff. Now, first off, we got two statues, two staffs, both a stick with snakes. Which one's Asclepius? Left or right? I heard right. Anybody any Greek mythology nerds in the audience want to tell me who the guy on the left is? Caduceus. I was also going to go with Hermes or Mercury. Hermes and Mercury also would have that staff with two snakes on it. The Asclepian staff only has a single snake. Yay! Oops, jumped ahead. And there were actually lots and lots of snakes at these temples. The temples were usually up on hills in very well aerated areas, pretty clean, good drinking water. It was a good place to go heal. Even if the treatments were garbage, you could go actually rehab yourself there pretty well. But there were a lot of snakes, and snakes were serving a couple of purposes there. Now, even if you're phobic about them, why is having a bunch of snakes in a healing temple not a terrible idea? What do snakes eat? Yeah, vermin, mice, rats, so they keep the vermin down. And symbolically, what do snakes do that very few other animals do? Shed their skin, not a bad metaphor for getting healthy again. So the snakes were present and associated with Asclepius probably for those reasons. All right. Now Asclepius mythologically had more than two daughters, but two in particular that were associated with healing, Hygeia and Panacea. And Hygeia is where we get the term hygiene. She was associated with preventative care, things that kept people healthy so they didn't get sick in the first place. So public health, disease prevention, maintenance of that balance that kept people healthy, whereas Panacea means the knowledge of all treatments, how you deal with somebody once they're already sick, what kind of drugs and treatments you can give. So you've already got a little bit of a separation, not an antagonistic separation, but an idea that preventative care and interventional care are actually two different things, but both are probably necessary. Now, the first big name of a person we know actually existed, there are some people who say not, but there's pretty good evidence that Hippocrates of Kos, which is an island off the Greek southern coast, is a real person. It's considered the father of Western medicine. And Hippocrates did something that we kind of take for granted now, but it was really a huge jump forward. He separated the practice of medicine from supernatural causes. If you were ill, if you got better, it wasn't because the gods favored you or were unhappy with you. It was because you had a disease. And the physicians could intervene if they were careful, attentive, and had the right treatments at the right time. So it was that idea that medicine could be something that was rational. Now, the theories that Hippocrates put forward are, by contemporary standards, pretty much garbage. But the idea that you would observe and track people's progression was important, as was the idea that physicians had to be held to a high standard of behavior, hence the Hippocratic Oath. You know this person wasn't going to behave in certain ways because they took an oath to behave one way with their patients and not tell secrets, not give poisons, etc. So his theory of health was not something he created, but he really codified it and made it ironclad, which was that you had 4 humors circulating throughout your body, and that disease was an imbalance of these humors that existed all through your body. It was a holistic idea that you had the 4 humors, they pervaded all your body, and they weren't just in you, they were tied to the 4 elements of Greek, we'll call it physics, Greek physics and the understanding of how the world worked. Blood corresponded to energy. If you had too much blood, you were sanguine. You're kind of happy, vibrant, ready to go. Yellow bile corresponded to sometimes fire. And I've got various versions of which corresponds to which humor, which element to which humor. There were some disagreements back then. But you had too much yellow bile, you were bilious, you were angry, it affected your mood. And depending on how you were born, you had a surplus of one of these humors that created your overall personality and fed into that. If you had too much black bile, melas coli, you were melancholy, you were sad. So ancient Greek emo kids were just, told they had too much black bile. And then phlegm, if you're phlegmatic, you've got too much phlegm that's corresponding to water. You're kind of waterlogged, you're kind of tough to get moving, sluggish, and so forth. Fun fact, the Greeks thought phlegm was actually your brain leaking out your nose. The brain was seen as supportive to the ventricles and really kind of inert otherwise. So how do these 4 humors and 4 elements manifest? It's actually kind of fun. They exist on kind of a Cartesian plane of opposites. You've got hot and cold, dry and wet, and someone can be described as one or more of these things. The foods that you eat can be described as dry foods or wet foods or cold foods. Somebody give me an example of something that's hot and dry that you would eat. I was going to say chili pepper is good. The Greeks didn't have those, but we do. What's a cold, wet food? There's actually one that the Greeks did recommend to people when they needed more cold, wet stuff in their diet? Hummus. There's a little garlic in there. It might be spicy. Cucumber is the classic example of a cold, wet food. So there are characteristics that were corresponding not just to individual people, but to foods, to areas, things like that. And the combination of something that was hot and wet corresponded to blood. Something that was dry and hot was the yellow bile, dry and cold, black bile, and cold and wet was making you phlegmatic. You had too much phlegm. Now think back for a second. If you've got too much phlegm and you're sneezing a lot and you're blowing your nose, what do you call that disease, that infection? You've got a And what did Grandma always say? If you're outside and it rains without a jacket, you're going to get cold and wet and you're going to get cold. There you go. So the humoral theory still hangs on, little vestiges of our spoken language. So amongst the things that Hippocrates pioneered was that professional identity of physicians as somebody of high moral character, and all the treatments were directed towards rebalancing the humors. They involved manipulations, they involved bleeding, cupping, purging, puking, enemas, the same stuff that the Greeks used. And one of the fun things that Hippocrates forbade students to do is cut for the stone. And there's a bladder stone up on the top right. Now, first off, you weren't supposed to cut for the stone. One, because it was a brutal, nasty operation. They didn't actually go for bladder stones in a suprapubic approach. They went after it perineally. Yeah. So it's not a fun thing to do, and it's not going to make you popular. But the other thing was, there was a whole class of people in ancient Greece who they were stone cutters. They would go after those stones. And Hippocrates, it's thought, told his students not to cut for stone, not because of the brutality and inevitable mortality associated with it. It's because you didn't poach on someone else's job. You didn't do this because there were already people out there and you weren't going to steal their patients from them. All right, now moving forward to Alexandria, northern Egypt, we start to have some evidence of actual inspection of the human body translating to medicine. There are two famous, we'll call them anatomists, although that wasn't really a concept at the time. There's Herophilus, who did, again, seems obvious, but he said, hey, you know how the heart beats and you know how we have pulses? They're actually the same thing. And we don't have any of his works, but we have things that people have described about his works, and he did early work in pathology, correlating what disease states happen and how they affect the body and the organs. Another Alexandrian anatomist, Erasistratus, developed something called the pneumatic theory. It wasn't really a competing theory with the humoral theory, it kind of went alongside it. And the idea here was that veins carry blood, arteries carry something called vital spirit, which is transformed into animal spirit when it reaches the brain's ventricles, and that pneuma, that vital spirit, that animal spirit then goes down your nerves to inflate your muscles. So if you think about your muscles, when you contract a muscle, what does it do? How does it feel? It gets a little more rigid, it expands like a balloon. And he thought that your muscles doing that was because you were blowing not air into them, but blowing pneuma into them, and that's what caused contraction. So treating people, let's mention for a second, consisted largely of the things we mentioned. You're trying to address the humors by bleeding people, purging, puking, etc. There were drugs, but they were largely derived from Egyptian sources, Greek sources, and there wasn't a great deal of experimentation. Things were codified and reorganized, but there wasn't really any experimentation. So much so that a book called De Materia Medica from the 1st century pretty much stayed in use in medical schools until about the 1600s. So not a great deal of experimentation and cutting away of ineffective treatments occurred throughout this whole period. So we had leeching, another one. If you want to get rid of someone's blood, you don't just have to venesect them, you can actually apply leeches. You can cup them, which is making a resurgence now. Whether you like it or not, you can think it's quackery, but the idea was to adjust the humors by applying a vacuum with a hot glass, putting it over somebody's back, and it sucks the skin up, causes some blistering, and it's supposed to affect the humors. So the next big name is in the 1st century in Roman times. He was Greek, but he lived during the Roman era, Galen of Pergamon. He was a Hippocratic physician who made it his life's goal to kind of get the fog away from Hippocratic treatments. A lot of people had added to the Hippocratic corpus the works of Hippocrates, and things had gotten really unclear. And he wanted to clarify things through experimentation, making it clear, and really coming up with a comprehensive system of how the body worked and how you could treat it. He worked as a physician to the Roman gladiators, so that's about the best way to see living anatomy back in the day, is actually look at the wounds and the organs and treat the gladiators and the horrific injuries they would sometimes get in the Colosseum or various other venues. He became the physician to the actual Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius. And he brought together the humoral and pneumatic theories and really tried to tie them to the actual structure of the body. He did a lot of dissections. He did a lot of investigations, figured out that the nerves carry motor impulses because he could cut a nerve in an animal and the downstream muscles would just instantaneously go flaccid. He did a lot of experimentation, but his system had a ton of errors by our contemporary standards. It was a big step forward at the time, but lots of errors. Everybody makes mistakes, but the problem is Galen thought everything he said was pure gold. And he said, whoever seeks fame by deeds, not alone by learned speech, need only become familiar with what I have achieved through my whole life in research, and that's it. If you know what I said, you know the right stuff because I'm perfect. Galen did not have any sort of problem with his ego. He loved thinking he was right and just writing massively nasty responses to anyone who disagreed. So let's talk a quick bit about what Galenic theory actually was. Chyle, not the guy, Chyle, from the gut, digested food moves to the liver, which converts it to blood. Blood from the liver goes through the venous system to get to all the organs of the body. The heart actually does pump blood, but the blood's only really in the venous system. The pulmonary artery takes blood to the lungs for certain impurities to get exhaled, so that's what the pulmonary artery is doing in his system. And air that comes in our trachea, gets to our lungs, is carried to the left ventricle through the pulmonary veins. And there, holes between the right and left ventricle allow blood to go from the right ventricle to the left side, and that transforms that blood into a different type of pneuma. It becomes vital spirit. Now, first things first. Second years, how many holes did you see between the ventricles in the heart? Yeah, there you go, none. But integral part of his physiology is that you've got these holes that allow blood to go through to the left side and becomes vital spirit. The arteries carry this vital spirit throughout the body, but particularly to the brain, where a network of vessels at the base of the brain, the miraculous network, also known as the rete mirabile, converts it to animal spirit. And that's what goes out through the nerves to the muscles and allows them to move. Galen said that the nerves were hollow, and that's what carried that animal spirit out to the muscles. First years, how many hollow nerves are you seeing so far? 0, because none of you cut into any of them. Yeah, okay, good. Good. So that's basic Galenic physiology. And Galen was taken very, very seriously. He saw the body as the product of not a monotheistic God, but something he called the demiurge, a pseudo-omnipotent being that designed the body. And this was easily reconcilable to the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars who came after the medieval era, or during the medieval era. Galen's writings were translated into Arabic, Greek, Latin, distributed very widely. It's thought that Galenic theories actually made it all the way into India and serve as part of the basis of Ayurvedic medicine. That's debatable, but that's one theory people put forward. And his experimental methods were very innovative at the time, but they were just completely ignored. In the medieval era, authority mattered more than independent observation and analyzing what you actually saw. So real quick run through for any history nerds. Galenic theory of anatomy, physiology, and medicine was unquestioned for about 1,300 years. During that time, quick run through, the Roman Empire fell, Anglo-Saxons invaded Britain, the Muslims conquered Spain, Constantine moved the Roman capital to Constantinople. The fall of the Roman Empire happened. Charlemagne was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. Vikings raided throughout Europe and all over the Mediterranean. The Magna Carta reduced the British king's power. The Crusades, lots of crusades happened from Europe into the Middle East and other places. The New World was discovered, and the Reconquista of Spain occurred. And the Protestant Reformation swept through Northern Europe. All the time, medicine didn't change. All that stuff going on, and medicine, same stuff, same ineffective treatments, same ineffective theories. Finally, we get to the Renaissance, where that idea of exploring new things and also going back to classical sources to see what we'd missed in older historical, political, religious, medical, scientific learning was being re-explored and errors were being discovered. So when Galen's system actually was made obsolete, it was because people applied the same experimental methods he himself had used, but did it more effectively. Now, during this time, the Muslim empires in Baghdad, Damascus, became very prominent. And a lot of the Greek and Roman learning that died out in Europe was kept alive because it was brought by scholars to those empires and maintained there. And a great deal of scientific work was done in the Muslim empires. I think astronomy, chemistry, physics, botany, huge advances were made there. Medicine, debatably not a lot. Surgery and examining the body was not considered something that was appropriate to do, so no real dissection occurred. The major surgical innovation that came through the Islamic empires at the time was cautery, actually using heated irons to stop bleeding. And one thing that was very well done, though, was the cataloging of diseases and medical treatments and reorganizing them, making them a little more sensible. One of the big names here was Rhazes. He tracked the course of diseases and actually figured out which diseases are different. Think about it for a second. If you don't know any medicine and somebody's got a fever, do you know what they've got? Somebody's throwing up. Do you know what they've got? Some diseases have very similar symptoms, and it's sometimes difficult to distinguish which one is which. And if you've got someone with multiple chronic illnesses, it may be very difficult to tell which one's which. Into the 18 and 1900s, we didn't know if syphilis and gonorrhea were two different diseases or just manifestations of the same one. So clarifying what diseases actually are distinct is a big deal. He worked with alchemy, brought distillation into treatment of medicine and making more effective drugs. And he was a free thinker who actually cast doubt on some of the things that Galen said. In both Europe and the Middle East, it was not really a great idea to question authority in the medieval era. It was something that was not taken real well, and he was actually blinded during a beating that he received because he was perceived to have said something sacrilegious or anti-Galenic that offended a local magnate. Other Islamic physicians and scholars were Avicenna. He wrote a ton of things on a ton of different topics, but he compiled this massive canon of medicine that stayed in use for many, many years, and Averroes, who brought together Galen and Aristotle. And this is actually what led to the massive interest in Aristotle in the medieval European universities. Most European universities got their information about Greek and Latin authors from Muslim sources that were then translated there. So you've got a situation where things were translated from Greek to Latin to Arabic back into Latin, and a lot of opportunities for errors and translational misunderstandings to occur. So we have a great deal of scientific progress being made in the Islamic civilizations in the medieval era, but then it all stops. Anybody know why? The Mongols. There we go. The Mongols rolled through the area, 1258, and absolutely destroyed Damascus, Baghdad. It was said that the rivers near the Temple of Learning in the area, the House of Learning, actually ran black with all the ink from the scrolls that was just dumped in the river during the Mongol invasion. So the scholars, Greek, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars who lived in the Islamic empires fled west, and they wound up in Europe. And nicely, there was a nice landing pad for these people in Europe. There was a great demand for learned people who could bring the classics into European universities, and the university had just really become a thing. It started originally with just wandering scholars whose students would follow them around. Then they kind of stayed in one place and the students congregated and began actually making physical buildings that became universities. So Paris, Padua, Bologna, Salerno, Montpellier, they were all early places where universities were established to teach, in this order, theology, law, and medicine. Medicine was low man on the totem pole. Anybody shocked? Thank God things have changed, right? Okay. But so people came there to study medicine, and there were actual courses of instruction. It was fairly well planned out, but it was still the Middle Ages. Now on the left, we've got a man with a broken arm, got a blinded guy behind him, and I'm assuming a guy with a hernia because no pants. And on the right, we've got a classroom. So this is the Middle Ages. What's the big thing to notice about these pictures? Yeah, they're not inspecting anybody. They're reading from the books. Okay, what does Galen say? Okay, go get bled. That'll be a chicken. Okay. So one thing that became very pronounced in the Middle Ages, especially in Europe, but was a holdover from both Islamic and Greek medicine, and I think was a very negative thing on Western civilization's development in general, was this massive disconnect and separation between intellectual activity and manual activity. Intellectual activity, just pontificating about the truth and beauty of the world, was far better than actually doing stuff. And so the physicians didn't actually want to touch their patients. They just wanted to kind of get a list of symptoms, look at the chart, okay, here's your treatment, bye. We don't do that anymore, right? Okay. Sorry. That distinction is still there, and manual labor still has a negative connotation compared to so-called intellectual things, although they really complement each other nicely. So essentially, you can see this in a nutshell when it comes to inspecting urine. People aren't allowed to really do a whole lot of touching of their patients because it's low status, but one thing physicians did do was look at vials of urine that their patients would pass and diagnose their disease based on the color, consistency, appearance of the urine. And do you think the physicians were the ones who were actually gathering the urine, passing catheters into people's penises so that they could actually get urine out into these vials? No, those were people we're going to hear a lot more about called the barbers or the barber surgeons. They actually did the work of opening up veins, bleeding people, getting the urine, cupping, leaching, all that good stuff. The thing in the middle of this picture is kind of fun. It's a urine wheel. So the color and consistency of the urine and various diagnoses that you would associate with it. Now, on the surface, not the best diagnostic you've got, but not the worst. A urinary tract infection makes the urine look different, as does muscle proteins, myoglobinuria in the urine, as well as bleeding. So it's not that it's a bad idea, but it was based on a medical concept that really didn't give you much to work with in terms of actual effective treatment. Now, just as we had Mongolian invasions destroying civilizations and setting things back, we had throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, the plague. Widely considered to be bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis came in on rats, and fleas from those rats would bite people, spread it from person to person, and no one really knew how the plague was spreading, but it killed at least roughly a half of the population of Europe, the Middle East, in the 1300s, with various other plagues cropping up thereafter. So this really brought to a head the fact that we had no idea what was going on medically. We had no idea how to stop it, what caused it, how it spread, and the best thing people could come up with, what it was spread by some contagion. It just passed from person to person. We didn't know how. One popular theory was it was a miasma, or bad air. You breathed in that bad air and that made your body sick. It upset your humors. You were out of balance and you developed the symptoms and signs of the plague. So it was blamed on a lot of things. Divine wrath, it's always a popular option for massive problems that are affecting whole societies and whole continents. Obviously, minorities were scapegoated. As always, the popular Scapegoat in Europe and the Middle East were Jews, and there's a lot of people blame Jews for poisoning wells in areas that were affected by the plague. No one really cared that the plague also affected places that didn't have any Jewish settlements, but scapegoating always takes a big step up whenever massive disruptions occur. And essentially miasmas became the thing people were most convinced caused the plague. Now, the famous plague doctor costume on the right didn't really come along until the 1600s in Paris. And does anybody know what the beak on the plague doctor costume was for? It wasn't just so you looked like a bird. Why did you have that?
Keep the bad air away.
Keep the bad air away. And people would put rose petals and scented oils and spices in there so that you're breathing that in and hopefully neutralizing the bad air, the miasma that's causing the plague. So the only thing that really worked, not surprisingly, was quarantine, keeping people with the plague isolated and not able to spread it. But because it was practiced so sparingly and so ineffectively, there was really no stop to the spread of the plague. So we'll do a whole talk on the history of surgery. But the barbers and barber surgeons were the people who actually conducted the medical treatments that physicians needed or prescribed. And these people actually had a huge advantage in terms of medical practice. They did stuff. They looked at how disease spread. They dealt with actual injuries and healing them. But the problem became that clergy, literate people, were prevented, or forbade rather, from practicing surgery, and it became a craft art practiced by people who had no literacy. So there was no real intellectual development of surgery in the medieval era because literate people were largely forbidden from practicing it. So it just became kind of an apprenticeship craft art that didn't develop much. Anybody know where the white and red barber pole comes from? What's that? Yeah, surgeons and barber surgeons not only bled people, they also started adding wound healing into their repertoire. So how do you advertise if people can't read? Well, you take a bloody rag and wrap it around a pole, put it outside your house, and people know, okay, that's where the barber lives. So, in the Middle Ages, leading up to the Renaissance, dissection and actual investigation of the human body was not forbidden, but it was very, very sporadically practiced. It wasn't until Pope Sixtus IV actually issued a bull saying that dissection was allowed for physicians and artists that it actually became a little more standard. And once or twice a year, there would be a public dissection at universities. It was usually in the winter because no preservation techniques. Started with the viscera because it goes bad first, ending on the limbs, which even though they get dried out, still maintain some of their consistency and don't rot as quickly as the organs. But take a look at this picture of a historical dissection. Look at the students. They're not even looking at the body. And it's because what mattered at the time was what Galen said. It was what they were supposed to know rather than what they saw. And the professor's the person up there in the pulpit. The professor had the text open and professed the truth of Galen. Just talked about what they were supposed to be seeing. The person actually doing the work wasn't a high status physician. Oh no, it was a instructor who had a stick, and he just kind of pointed at what the students were supposed to be seeing. And the person doing the actual work was a barber or a butcher, actually cutting open the body and trying to display stuff. Probably didn't know what the person talking about the Galenic text was talking about and just kind of opened stuff up as best he could. So years and years of fruitless, ineffective dissection. Now I mentioned artists. Artists and physicians were the people allowed to dissect because it was felt that it was important for them to portray the human form correctly. And Renaissance artists are where we start to see actual anatomical detail in art for the first time in Western history. Leonardo da Vinci did many dissections and actually discovered lots of problems with Galen, planned to actually make an anatomy atlas. Never came to fruition. Leonardo had a real problem with starting projects and never finishing them off. But he did some amazing things that were only discovered years later. He did cross sections. Nobody even thought to do that before. Cut into the skull, described how the air sinuses were, did cross sections of the lower limb in his notes, investigated how the uterus and the fetus actually sit inside there. But no one knew about it because he was a little paranoid about being too publicly known to doubt Galen because that was a dangerous thing to do at the time. Michelangelo actually spent a lot of time dissecting. At 17, he snuck out of his house in the night to dissect because his father really didn't want him to be an artist, so he had to sneak out. At one point, his dad caught him coming back home after a night dissecting. He's like, "What were you doing out all night?" He's like, I was drinking and hanging out with loose women," because that was better than admitting that he was actually studying to be an artist. But he did a lot of dissection throughout his career, and his anatomical features, the muscles, are actually very accurate, and he had little tricks that he put in there. Take a look at the picture. So he had little anatomical tricks that he kind of would put into various pictures. There are actually still publications coming out with, "Hey, we noticed something else that Michelangelo did. It looks a lot like this organ." So the big step forward in anatomy and medical treatment came with this guy, Andreas Vesalius, professor of anatomy at Padua. He was a classically trained Galenic physician, but he also grew up in Brussels, very close to the hanging grounds where executed criminals would be executed. Obviously, criminals would be executed. You don't execute someone who's already executed. Actually, they did that to one of the popes, but that's another story. So he would walk past the scaffold every day, and at the time in Brussels, they just left the condemned up to hang until their bodies just kind of fell apart. So he'd see the muscles and the ligaments and the bones, and he'd actually steal legs and kind of look at them and see how the ligaments worked. So he practically knew more about anatomy than anyone else at the time, just because he'd actually looked at real structure and how it was from surface to deep. And he didn't like the way he was taught. He brought skeletons into class and would actually demonstrate the anatomy to students rather than just droning on and on about Galen. And over time, he discovered many errors in Galen, errors that by definition weren't supposed to be there because Galen was perfect. Muscle and skeletal details were wrong. The blood does not move between the right and left ventricle directly unless you've got a ventricular septal defect, and most of us don't. And humans have no rete mirabile. The cornerstone of Galenic physiology doesn't exist. There's nothing there to convert that pneuma into animal pneuma that actually goes out to our bodies and helps us move. And eventually figured out it was because Galen never dissected a human being. He only ever dissected animals and apes. And he put it really nicely. He said, Galen was misled by his monkeys. So how do you think this went over when he published it? Very badly. His instructor actually publicly disowned him and said that if Galen was wrong, it wasn't because Galen was wrong, it was because the human body had changed in the intervening centuries. So here's what anatomical illustration looked like before him. Very, very abstract. I can't even tell you what's going on in this picture. And there's the heart, liver, sure. I have no idea what that is, maybe stomach. The intestines are here, there's no uterus. It's just weird. Compare that to what Vesalius and one of Titian's students, Stephen von Kalkar, produced. They put together a work called De Humani Corporis Fabrica on the makeup of the human body. Now, there are errors in this book, but they're pretty minor. I could teach from this book from the 1550s if push came to shove. It's so well done and so accurate that not only was a huge step forward with medicine, it's just as prized as a work of art because of the massive step forward and just accuracy that was brought to this. So Vesalius was attacked from all sides for publicly doubting Galen for publishing it, but it was out there. And Vesalius is one of the first people to be considered kind of a forerunner of modern science, because in his book he said, here is what the human body looks like, and if you don't believe me, go look for yourself. Here are steps to go see what I've seen. It wasn't good enough that he just saw it and you had to believe him. He gave people instructions on how to replicate what he had done so that he encouraged a healthy skepticism. So eventually he got sick and tired of fighting with the Galenic academics at Padua, became physician to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Didn't work out so well. Charles V had a lot of other physicians who were Galenists and really didn't like Vesalius. So he went to a pilgrimage in the Holy Land, and on his way back got sick and was shipwrecked actually on a Greek island, Zakynthos, and died there. But the book was out there, the book was available, and people started taking it seriously as surgery and other fields became a little more scientific and a little more investigational in their nature. The last thing I'm going to leave you with was the transition from the medieval to the Renaissance to the modern mindset is fairly well embodied in this guy, William Harvey. I was talking with a student the other day about how much they liked math. They liked it when we had math and biostats. Some of you may disagree. But those of you who love math and physiology and equations, you can thank William Harvey for getting that into medicine. He did the first quantitative study in the history of medicine, and what he found was Galen couldn't be right about how the blood was produced, because if it was, and we just had the blood produced from food, the liver washed it out, and that was it, we'd have to produce about 540 pounds of new blood every day to accommodate the volume of blood that's pushed with each heartbeat. So he said, there's got to be a way that blood returns. And he did a lot of investigations and basically hypothesized that capillaries exist to carry blood from arteries to veins and back to the heart in a cycle. Now, it turns out some Islamic scholars and Chinese scholars had beaten him to the punch in that particular regard, but their works were unknown at the time. And Harvey's works were not only out there, they were referenced thereafter. So priority, maybe not, but he was able to make a pretty substantial contribution to further studies because people were able to reference his work thereafter. He also noted that the veins only allow blood to go one way. How many centuries had people been bleeding people from these veins, noted that the valves were there, and never thought, hey, these prevent the blood from moving in the opposite direction? So he took Galenic anatomy and superseded it through experimentation. And that's going to be the theme we follow for the rest of these talks. So next time, we're going to talk about how theories of health and disease actually changed in the intervening centuries, bringing us up to the modern day. QR codes are apparently still a thing, which is good because writing down long addresses is kind of annoying. So I've got a collection of books here if anybody wants to catch them. I'll have this picture at the end of subsequent lectures, but feel free to check it out. And thank you very much.